Welcome, everyone. My name is Isabelle, the director of DIVAN, the Diasporic Vietnamese Artists Network. The organizations, and She Was No Master is a program of DIVAN. So in 1990, when I was a graduate student, some of us wanted to write poetry, write stories, and there was really no space for us to tell a story. So with a group of artists and graduate students, journalists in the communities, we just got together to create space for us to tell our stories, because the story of Vietnamese, right, 30 years ago was, there was no room because of the outcome of the Vietnam War. Either it was from the left, from the right, even from Asian Americans. There was not always welcome. So 30 years later, this group that we started called Ink and Blood grew to what's become the Diasporic Vietnamese Artists Network today, DIVAN. And one thing that is very different than 30 years ago is that at the time I was the only woman, and there was a lot of guys drinking cognac and playing pools and writing poetry with the cigarettes. So now I'm the director. We actually make sure that women have a group, have a space to support one another. Maybe sometimes we smoke, sometimes we play pool, sometimes we drink cognac, but it's really for us to center that voice. So, this group is from a member of She Was No Masters. In addition to supporting the Vietnamese women of the diaspora, we also have public events. On March 3rd, actually, on Tuesday, we're going to start this program called DIVAN at San Francisco State University. And I see some of my former students here. And I just want to let you know we did it. And the idea is to work with students to make San Francisco a hub of diasporic Vietnamese artists, cultural production, storyteller, poets from all generations. So that's the visions, and we're going to start to do this. But we also have events elsewhere, in Seattle, in New York, in Paris, in Vietnam, as much as we can. And we also offer writing residencies for emerging writers and for a group of writers. And finally, we do publications. But I think I'm going to stop here because we have a whole program. And it's just maybe...
is this on? Is this one on? Okay. My name's Dao Strom, and I'm a member of She Who Has No Masters. And I'm going to explain a little bit of context about what we're going to do here. Our collective is a loose collective of Vietnamese women writers of the diaspora, and really we began kind of as a salon in Isabelle's living room, just this idea of, I actually had not met very many Vietnamese writers at the beginning of my writing career. And I knew about the work of Angie Chau and Aimee Phan before I actually met them in person. And so we got together with sort of this idea of reading to each other, sharing work, and creating a more supportive environment. And it's grown from there, and we do collaborative writing events, and we're working on a multimedia exhibit, which will be sort of a form of hybrid literature. And part of it is the challenge and also the joy of bringing together writers who have really individual, strong practices, but seeing what happens when we come together and work together, and that being a different type of paradigm for creativity and for being writers together, which is often a very solitary practice. For those of you who are writers, you probably understand that. So what we're going to do here is we're going to read a collective poem that has multiple voices in it. We call it a multi-voiced poem. And it's made up of different voices. Our own voices are in it, but actually in this poem there's other writers who aren't present. So we're going to be reading their parts, and the idea is for the lines, the voices just to come together in one space. And then we're each going to do individual readings after that point. So I'm going to put this down. Okay.
I just want to make sure this is working.
Yeah, are everyone's microphones on?
Hey.
Okay. So this is called Love, Object, Treason, and that was sort of the theme that we were working with. Just experiences or how those words resonate with each of us as Vietnamese women, as writers. Love, Object, Treason. It always begins something like this, with the attempted placement of one mouth over another.
Shintok, métisse, étrangère.
They don't want you. They don't even know you. They don't care to know you.
As a yellow girl, you did not speak, he said. You could not possibly write.
You're a perfect little China doll. You're so exotic. You remind me of my boa.
The looking can be okay. It can even feel thrilling. You realize this is hypocritical.
Her mocha skin would simply look amazing against the white interior of your white Rolls Royce.
You waking to you as body, as oppositional territory.
You can fill your body with anything.
Truth is, there is only one country.
Plural, mutable, overlaps.
The white American veteran who came to your table where you lunched with your mother gestured toward you and said he saw children like you going through the garbage back in Vietnam.
It's either him or me, you think, and wonder who will win your mother in the end.
You see the street of garbage and wonder what it means being the refuse, the refused.
Dear Ma, stop blaming yourself. You helped me. You ignored my aunts when they told you to be worried that I was acting like a boy.
A softness into which you sink. How deep will you go, you wonder? How much longer will the ground hold you? Betrayed once more by your body.
And you have seen the way the men look at you, and then towards the man who has brought you into the room, stating, I'm like an eagle, you see.
You have remembered these lines and collected them like sea glass in a mason jar. Later, you learn that sea glass is derived from trash, from discarded soda and wine bottles, windows and headlights, all of it broken and tossed, then tumbled smooth by waves before being washed ashore.
A rock inside your throat that throbs each time you misread once for love.
You didn't hear that. You didn't see that. Just forget about it.
When was the first time you felt loved?
Once I escaped from you to return to myself, then escaped from fear by returning to you. Yet I finally escaped you to return home. Meanwhile, you never traced my scars with your forefinger at dusk.
Counting those who have come into your life because of the war, and those who have left it because of the war. You search the crowds of people, looking for men whose faces are kind, but also smart, who understand cruelty, but choose not to pass it on.
Dear Jay, I didn't know it as a child. You, radiant man, with your gaze of pure adoration, changed me. You taught me how to love.
Our Lady of the Rusted Tongue, Our Lady of the Snake Skin, Our Lady of the Wrong Kind.
We were never at a loss for words, were we? Only sounds did we jumble. Or was it love? Thanks.
Hello, thank you all for coming. So, one of the other collaborative poems, one of the first ones we worked on, was a poem about the things we inherited from our mother. And so I thought in that theme of thinking about the things that we talked together and shared together, I would read an essay, a brand new essay that I worked on a few months ago, so this is all new. And this is about my mom and the changes that have happened recently between us. When we first moved into our Edwardian house, I instructed the movers to place the tall bookshelf in the doorway between our unit and my mother's. Right here, he asked to be sure. Who would ever heard of blocking a door like that? Yes, I said. My mother overheard this exchange while unpacking cardboard boxes in her kitchen. I reminded her that this was the condition we agreed upon when we decided to move in together. In order for this to work, to live with me, my husband, and 2 kids, we needed our own spaces to respect boundaries and minimize arguments. She had agreed. An hour later, I found my mother hiding in her new bathroom, half the size of the bathroom she had in her old house. Her eyes were puffy and red. This isn't what I expected, she said. I wanted to be close to you and your family. Part of me thought she was trying to manipulate me, invade my space, and take control of my life. But another part of me believed her. It had been an exhausting move for our family, one that had dragged on for months. The house hunting, the failed bids, the delayed escrow, and finally move-in day. My family was leaving our beloved rent-controlled flat with a spacious backyard for this new shared house with my mom. It wasn't our dream house, but a compromise. And like all compromises, every side is just a little bit unhappy. But my mother's transition was undeniably much harder. She was relocating from a 4-bedroom house she shared with my father, her husband for over 40 years, into a 500-square-foot in-law to live with us. In doing so, she had to throw away decades of furniture, clothes, mementos, and plants, and squeeze what was left over of her life into this new space. I texted my friend. She, along with her husband and 2 children, also lived with her widowed mother and was serving as a counselor, cheerleader, and mentor through this difficult process. Move the bookshelf, she advised me. So I did. I also unlocked the door. I am usually not this cruel. To understand why this happened, we'd have to go back 6 months to my father's funeral, when my mother first announced in the living room of my brother's house, in front of our relatives, that she intended to move to Berkeley to live with me and my family. The pronouncement was not a total surprise. She'd been hinting at it for years, but the gall of her assumption rattled me. I was still grieving my father's loss, and now I'd have to absorb my mother's grief and expectations. The months after my father's death were always going to be hellish. He'd been my preferred parent, my favorite person in the world, a fact that many relatives pointed out to me, how much I loved him and preferred him. I took no joy when they shared this obvious observation, cringing at my immaturity and how I so brazenly rejected my mother for years. But I also think she didn't care. Her gentleness and humor had always seemed reserved for our father. We had had a combative relationship since my childhood, and my father, a sweet, joyful, giggling man who disliked conflict, had been the sentimental glue that kept me, my mother, and brother together. He had been everyone's favorite, and when he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's 13 years earlier, it devastated us. I resented having to talk to my mother rather than my father. But as the years of his disease slowly stripped away everything we loved about him, he brought us closer together, handing her the phone when I called home, always looking to my mother for answers when I asked questions. My mother, brother, and I had to coordinate my father's illness and caretaking. With our peacemaker gone, we had to find our own way to connect and agree. Hunting for a house, already a nightmare in the Bay Area, took on new layers of impossibility. How were we going to find a home large enough to contain my mother and me, one where I wouldn't regret this life change that I felt had been forced upon us? At weekend open houses, I strode through various house plans, quickly learning to assess within seconds if the property could accommodate 2 separate spaces. Two structures were ideal, where we could potentially go for days without seeing each other, like our lives had been for the previous 2 decades. The houses up in the hills offered ideal square footage, but that would be too far from the city center, where she would need to walk and socialize to rebuild her life. She also needed a place without stairs. We recognized this in the way she slowly rose and sat down at meals, how she clutched railings and door frames, and our arms when getting into and out of the car. When we found the Edwardian, less than a mile from our current rental, it met all of our desired specs. But it was a single structure of 2 floors with a locked door in between our units. In order to maintain privacy, I suggested we block the door, treating it like another wall. And when we wanted to visit each other, we could walk around the corner and use our respective front doors. It seemed practical and not so harsh at the time. When my brother and I were little, my parents had been horrified at the American preference to farm out their aging parents into nursing homes and proclaimed that that would never happen to them. And so far, they've had their wish, and in the process, burned through more resources than they'd ever imagined. It is expensive to grow old and die. My mother had been the sole caretaker of my father during his long, painful descent into Alzheimer's. Unwilling to allow others to witness my father's condition and pity them, she often isolated herself in the house with my father, only permitting immediate family to visit. Now she was free from that burden, and now it was my turn to guide my mother through her so-called golden years. I didn't want it to be as torturous for her. After years of caretaking, my mother deserved her life back. I just didn't imagine I'd be such a central part of it. She was used to being the queen of the house. When I was little, she barged into my room during our arguments, sitting right next to me, even as I howled for her to leave. She'd grimly respond that she paid for this house, the bed I was hiding in, the pillow over my face, so she could sit wherever she'd like. So when she announced her plans to live with my family, this was the first memory to return. My dread imagined the nightmarish scenarios. I feared waking up in the middle of the night to her standing over the bed I shared with my husband, asking for my help with finding her glasses or driving her to the bank or lecturing me on how I should raise my kids. I began to mourn the rest of my life, imagining the years ahead of serving as her caretaker. The last time we lived together, we had no boundaries. We saved our cruelest insults for each other. My father and brother recognized when they should stay away and when they should tear us apart. During another fight, she claimed she knew me very well, better than anyone else. And for many years, I considered this the biggest insult. Once we finally moved into the house, I'd remind myself every morning that with each passing day, things would get a little better. We'd become more settled, more moved in, more used to this new life together. And it did. My mother respected the open door boundary, even to the point where I was often visiting her and encouraging her to come up and share meals with us. But she was slowly acclimating to her independent life and liking it. The city senior center was only 2 blocks from her house. She met other Asian grandmothers and widows in the neighborhood, and together they'd roam the aisles of grocery stores comparing prices of produce or taking trips to Chinatown for noodle soup. I adapted to her living downstairs and the loud Vietnamese soap operas we could hear through the floor at all hours of the night. And she never complained about the kids' soccer balls bouncing above her ceilings. In the mornings, if I wasn't rushing off to work or the kids' school, I'd bring her coffee or a smoothie, depending on her glucose level that week, and check if the stove was wiped clean. In the evenings, I'd make sure her door was deadbolted and the windows shut. My husband assembled a raised garden bed in our small backyard where she could grow her herbs. She'd join us upstairs for weekend dinners or takeout. Her favorite weekend day trip was the beach, although after a few hours, she always got cold and asked if we could go home earlier than we wanted. A few months later, her ophthalmologist suggested cataract surgery for both of her eyes. She needed someone to drive her to the procedure and assist her with the additional weeks of eye drops and general recovery. My mother was nervous about the procedure, asking if she could do one eye at a time like her other friends had done. But when she realized it was one copay and one recovery period to do both, she agreed. I talked up the benefits of the elective surgery, how she would be able to see things that she hadn't in years. The gorgeous sherbet sunsets visible from our house every evening, the gradation of color in the flowers she stood in line to receive from the senior center every Tuesday. The world would be reborn through new eyes. But she held her purse to her chest, and when the nurse took her vitals during the pre-op, asking the same questions about risk and recovery and if they could only do one eye instead. I was relieved when the nurse replied to my mother in Vietnamese, assuring her it was a simple surgery and she would be out in only a few hours. During the surgery, I sat in the waiting room, checking email and texting updates to my brother. Eventually, I looked up and realized I was surrounded by other grown children, waiting for their parents to return from their own cataract surgeries. When the nurse opened the door to the waiting room, my mother slowly walked out with her, wearing special protective glasses that made her look like a racquetball player. "Do you see me?" I asked, standing, waving my hands dramatically over my head. She slowly blinked at me a few times, smiling. "Yes," my mother said, "I do." And that's it. Thank you.
This is an excerpt from a new work. It's with a lot of creative license. It all starts with a name. My middle name was given by father. Lan was the name of his mistress in Vietnam. For him, this name is a body that sways in a nursing outfit, a body with soft brown skin without panties underneath a white uniform, hands that carry a tray with a bowl of chicken soup, a piece of baguette and a glass of water, the scent of orange blossom and sweat, fingers that make him feel alive and make him want to live regardless of the unfairness of the world stacked against him. This name is a moment in a faraway place that makes him forget that in the eyes of others, he cheated on his first wife, abandoned 3 children, and was not a team player at work. Most preoccupied he was attending to his vegetables and following the scent of ashes and cherry blossom with a trumpet nose and a charming smile. My first name came from mother, when she too was in a hospital bed. It happened right after my birth while leafing through a sleek color magazine the size of her torso. She barely read French, and she knew where she wanted to go. If she did not make it to the destiny of her choice in this lifetime because of this child, her daughter will. She turned the page of the giant magazine one by one until she came to the image of a woman with a magnificent indigo dress. A beautiful and a dignified woman, an educated woman, a rich woman who looked in mother's eyes with a knowingly smiles. In a caption underneath were printed the words, Princess Katarina. As for my family name, it is a name that I kept because it made no sense for me to take the one of a man I could not pronounce. In middle school, the name Bula was rolled into the word pelot, which translates badly into ball of wool. This sounds neutral enough, but when sing-song in mockery tone and darting eyes, it does not have a good sound. It rubs against the grains of passing. My French family members do not care of these names either, but for other reasons. They secretly wish to be called Brémondard after their great-grandfather who slept with a linen maid and, when their sons were born, gave Miss Bula a little sack with enough EQ to send the baby far away enough from his castle so that he never find his way back. It is maybe not surprising that all the firstborn of his descendants abandoned their first child and did not find comfort in the sound of their mother's last name. I have, of course, other names. You may have heard them, some of them. Eurasians, mixed race, Pocahontas, Mexican, white, Asian American, Chino, French, Susie Wong, Kane for old age, good for nothing, martyr, selfish, too nice, Life can be confusing sometimes. I studied the world of consciousness outside a French village called Les Vallières, not far from the Loire River, edged by castle you see in postcard here. Father and mother have a thing for castle, you see. At 102, father had a dream that he received a letter stating that the Brémondards family recognized me as their legitimate heir, and to make amends for the ancestors' mistake, gave me a castle. Even years later, mother still reminds me from time to time of this dream because princess, she say, ought to live in a castle. The secrets to be aligned with your destiny, she explained, is to forget and to believe. Because she does not trust I will listen to her, she helps me out by making up story and repeat in different ways that everything I remember has never happened. And that if I insist of telling lies, she does not give me permission to write them. And she says, I won't sign paper for you to tell story. I do not need your signature, I respond, but why not? I ask, not expecting an answer since she's deaf. Because they will make fun of you and they will make fun of us. Who are they? I ask in shock about her sudden ability to hear. All of them, the French, Vietnamese, Americans, they are all racist. Oh, you know that. But if I tell your story, people will understand you, they will feel for you. I respond already defeated, already knowing her answer. Really? You really think so? What kind of education do you have? Is that what you've learned in American school? How can you believe such a stupid thing? Mothers see her stubbornness in me and expect disobedience. I am a daughter after all. So the next time I visited her, she told me for hours on end the story of how she became so successful, without mentioning that in other people's eyes, she's a treacherous daughter, a stranger that destroyed the family and now lives in utterly poverty. In the way she spoke, though, I saw a faint green light for me to tell. But I also heard in between her sentences that if I was going to betray her by being a writer, I will have to wait until she passes away, and that the story better brings me a castle. After listening to the omitted, I took a photo of mother and I and posted it on social media on Mother's Day. The next day, on the comment section, a Vietnamese man had written in French, "Your mother was a slut that slept with the enemy. She betrayed her people." I unfriended this man with that panic that takes over when I feel caught in a bad act. Mother may have a point. No matter what we remember, share, or withhold, people will only see what they choose or are taught to see. But if we, the people, all stick so readily to our own story, why can't Mother and I and people like us be part of the we? Why can't our story count, and why do we have to hide? And what will happen if we shifted our feet even so slightly from the island on which we stand and breathe as if air was ours to inhale? Mother's ancestors are not the Gallic, like my middle school French teacher had me recite on Tuesdays. They are Vietnamese. Growing up, when I asked Mother about the Vietnamese, she looked away and asked if I have eaten yet. To begin contemplating telling her story, I have to knit the bits of string story that were handed out to me, and those that I found, and those that I searched on the ground rotting in dark corners. I've asked a sibling, a niece, a cousin related by blood or favor. I read history book, ethnography, memoir, novel, and poetry, watched movies. I counted months back and forth on the tip of my fingers 12 times. I compared, I took note, transcribed, interpreted, erased, and invented. I started over each time Mother spoke until the day I ran out of time. Every story needs a beginning. This story has to begin with a stutter. Who do I choose to start with? The Gaul or the Vietnamese? Frozen from the start, I put my heels down, I stomp, I walk forward, look back in one acrobatic gesture. The idea is to unfreeze but stand still and keep my eyes open, although I was told from birth to keep them shut. I look for sign. I see one there that says, not this way. This will have to be the door to which I enter. Like mother, I am a door breaker. And like all door breakers, we have marks on our hands that won't go away. I refuse to choose between mother and father, or at least not in the way that is laid in front of me. My Vietnamese and my Gallic ancestors have something in common, you see. They were both afraid to have their heads severed by a guillotine. From mother's side, great-grandfather wanted to free his land from the French, who said they were there to help while shipping resources abroad to enrich himself. The consequences of not believing the story, of having to be civilized for his own good and remain blind to the obvious and act according to his desires, was to have his head cut off by a steel blade and one severed, for his spirit to be lost and condemned to wander the earth without a place to rest for eternity. This fear kept him at night, so he got up one day and applied to work for a French bank. His wife licked his wounds by giving him 10 children in acid resentment, while he buried his rage and his sorrow under the folds of an aoyai too tight for her to wear. From father's side, great-grandfather was terrified of the guillotine too. All of his siblings' heads were cut during the French revolutions. Him too woke up with cold sweat at night when the blade standing tall above the nape of his bare neck, standing above it in free fall. To save that neck, he married a woman with enough dough to buy him a private army and a castle. That she was not his type did not seem such a terrible arrangement compared to the prospect of losing a head. His wife licked his wound by giving him 10 children in acid resentment, and he buried his rage and his sorrow under the skirt of a laundry girl. The story of my ancestors do not define me, of course, and they cannot be held responsible for the rocks stuck inside my throat, and for the vague knowledge that my head is not quite attached as solidly to my body as I feel it ought to be. My ancestors have, however, planted the flag on which I set foot the day I learned to walk on a single track. Ready, set, go, live, fall, and learn, eyes shut. Hidden within the gap between the pebbles of my throat, a mother's dread to not have enough to eat, meshed with father's dread to not have enough money to live. And like for yours, they were the don't, and like for you, they were the don't and the do messages rolled in my direction in a glass bottle. Do not leave an empty plate, for we did not have enough food to eat. Do not complain, for our shoes were too small and we did not have nice clothes to wear. Do not use water, for we did not have enough water to drink and shower with. Do not trust people, for the world is filled with monsters that want to eat you. Do not love, for it makes you weak, and if you are weak, you will be eaten alive. Do not trust your heart, for you may risk losing your head. Do not postpone for tomorrow what you can do today. Do study and watch me sacrifice my life for you. Do save me and forget why. Do as you please and don't ever look back. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for coming out and sharing your evening with us today, and also thank you to the Asian Art Museum for hosting us in this beautiful stage. So, in the spirit of talking about womanhood and motherhood, I'll start with this portrait of motherhood. My mother never wore a skirt past 40. She didn't want to try looking young and look like a tramp instead. My mother never wore makeup. She didn't want to appear as if she were trying, uncouth for a woman to try at all. She didn't smile often, but when she did, it was a graceful line, almost a blessing. For my first school picture, she showed me how to do the same. She showed me how to lift my lips at the corners. She showed me how to make my mouth moist. She showed me how to pout without puckering. She sat straight-backed, chin up, hands resting on her lap. But when I smiled, my lips parted. She said, "Remember, a lady never exposes an open mouth." She studied me with sad disdain in my muddied elbows and blue jeans grass-stained. She spoke into the chasm between my legs. If only God had spared a bit more dough. If only he had made you a boy, my mother said. She slapped my knees together and simmered. She lit a cigarette and exhaled. She stared into the sun and squinted. She looked at her hand on the window, at her fingerprints in the dust, at her fist against the pane. She looked at the black boys with boomboxes, the asphalt with homeless men, the buses hissing beneath our building. And then she returned to her own reflection. She studied it from all sorts of angles, a dull object, a sharp blade. "If I didn't love you so much," she said, "this face could still take me away from here." And then this piece is called Alphabet Food Poem, dedicated to Vita at 1. I wrote this at the Jurassic residency, where I was lucky enough to be with these talented writers on stage here, but it was also the first time I was away from my daughter, and this is what emerged. A is for anise, star-shaped, and the secret spice in your Bang Wai's famous barbecue ribs. B is for blackberries and the buckets full we will pick together in late summer Bolinas afternoons. C is for crab, roasted in garlic, zested with blood oranges, a Christmas Eve tradition from the year you were born. D is for donut holes, piping hot and steaming fresh, a dozen for $1 and your father's favorite deal. E is for eggs fried over easy with rice and soy sauce when we are sick or simply homesick. F is for flan, brown and caramelized, quivering on the plate because she didn't have the words to say sorry. G is for gazpacho, cool and crisp at the beach house in Spain after we raced to the buoy and back. H is for honey in your tea on a rainy day as we quietly watch the hummingbirds hover above the deck. I is for ice cream and the glimmer in your eyes at your first bite on your first birthday as everyone cheered. J is for jawbreakers and my promise to allow you things for no other reason than because it's fun. K is for key lime pie, tangy and tart as we drive through the keys with the top down and music blasting. L is for longins, when life was sweeter, when your grandmother still wore a bikini before Saigon fell. M is for milk, our communion in the wee hours as I sat humbled by what you showed me my body could do. N is for the noodle soup we will slurp together, side by side, over a lifetime. Mì phở hủ tiếu, bún riêu, bún cuốn, bún bò Huế. O is for oysters, raw, briny, complicated, unyielding, salty, mythical, coveted, like all great loves can be. P is for pizza, the food of submission, when your grandparents finally accepted their new life, still the only American food they eat. Q is for quail, what I ordered my first time at an expensive restaurant and how I learned that fancy isn't always better. R is for risotto, you will patiently stir while I share with you the story of your mother's Italian past. S is for shrimp, curled shy like the jitters on the first day of school before it breaks out of its magnificent shell. T is for tacos and a beer after a mother-daughter surf session at our favorite break in Honolulu. U is for uni, sea urchin straight from its spiny shell because you are already curious, undaunted, and have a taste for adventure. V is for vermicelli and grilled shrimp, light and refreshing, spicy, sweet and savory, crunchy from the peanuts, silky from the noodles, perfect in its contrast, just like you. W is for watermelon, so ripe it drips from your mouth and fingers, sweet as your first kiss. X is for simoy, a salted plum served as a candy because nothing Vietnamese will ever be plain, sweet, and one note. Y is for yams, your first food because you were born in November, our 2018 Thanksgiving baby, so lovely and sweet. We thank the universe for you each and every day. Z is for zucchini blossoms, plucked at summer's harvest, dusted and fried, melting in our mouths over a glass of rosé, because they are seemingly delicate, yet spectacularly resilient, something I already see in you, my love. Thank you.
Okay. So thank you all for being here. And I want to thank Isabelle and Aimee and Angie, especially for joining me for this event. And I'm going to read just two really short passages from The Gentle Order of Girls and Boys. I actually wrote this book more than a decade ago. And it consists of 4 novellas, 4 long stories. And each one is about a different Vietnamese American woman. So in a way, sort of what I conceived about this book, that it would contain like these multiple perspectives in it. I feel like, and I wrote about this in the new introduction a little bit, that this was sort of a fitting like precursor to She Who Has No Masters, which is in like a very physical and collaborative way, sort of what evolved for me, trying to bring together different women's voices. The book has 4 stories, or it's conceived as 4 stories, but there's actually a 5th one in the middle, and I call it an interlude. And it takes the perspective of a young male character, actually a son, looking at his mother. And that's what I'm going to read from. And it's called View of Mother, and I'm just going to read a couple short passages and to fit with our themes for the night. On summer mornings, after having served his breakfast and then padded in her flat terry slippers and girlish white-blue nightgown back down the hall to the bedroom to dress, she would re-enter the kitchen with a swift, glowing quality that confused him. He could not understand why it had to be like that, or what had become so quickly of the mother who had stood there just minutes before, sleepily frying bacon at the stove, wearing eyeglasses, black hair tumbling down her back in fat, lazy, silken curls. Returning, she broke the spell of the kitchen and his breakfast with the harriedness of someone bursting in from outdoors. She was busy, magical, exuberant, contained all at once. Her hair was swept back in a low ponytail. Her eyeglasses were gone. Her clothes showed the shape of her body, just as her ponytail, gleaming black, now revealed the shape of her skull. From his spot on the cool vinyl floor, on the same brown curlicue pattern diamond each morning, he saw first her bare feet and her legs up to her knees, and then the hem of her flared white wraparound skirt, less opaque than her skin, always this outfit in his memory. She moved around him in porcelain, red and black flashes, red lips, red blouse, eggshell white toes. He watched his mother wield a large knife over small pieces of fruits and vegetables. He watched as she pounded and sliced and peppered meat, wrapped it in cellophane, and placed it in a bowl with grotesque, vacuous calm. He watched her sweep up fallen leaves from the potted plant in the corner using a hand broom and small dustpan. Sometimes she spoke to him in a sing-song voice, asking questions he didn't realize called for answers. Adults often spoke like that when they spoke to him, and he had come to understand that their questions were not serious. "Christian, are you eating a yummy popsicle?" when it was plain that he was. When his mother used this tone, he took the content of what she said to be of little consequence. He knew the only thing that mattered then was her love. It was there in her voice, and it bargained with him. "I will be this sweet if you too will be sweet." Its cadence went, my boy," over and over, and may have been saying only that for all he cared. Her words to his ears were just a lulling, unbroken stream of sound or fog encircling him, following him through the world of their home, ensuring him always of her proximity. He did not go out of her earshot. He did not go out of earshot of her if he could help it. As the day wore on, the morning light faded and softened. Afternoon came in, feeling very orange and shady and sleepy. At some point, his mother would take on a quality similar to her early morning self. In the kitchen again, looking peaceful, pouring lemonade over chunky, misting squares of ice. Maybe, too, by now she would have let her hair down again. So hot and cold she was. I'm going to stop there. And I think we're going to move into a little bit of discussion with the four of us. Thank you. How are we doing for time?
Hi.
Are we?
Hi.
Okay. So we thought we would have a little bit of discussion, and instead of having a moderated panel, we kind of wanted to moderate ourselves or just talk to each other. And then I think we'll open it up for a little more Q&A, so this can maybe lead into that. So I'll start with the first question that we had in mind, and maybe we'll each answer it or talk about it. So we are all writers who are also women and mothers. So one of the questions I thought we would talk about is how we manage motherhood in writing. What are some of its challenges or benefits? And I think we're all at different stages also. Some of us have older children, so how has your writing changed or been affected over the years or recently by being a mother? Who would like to start?
Angie's the newest, so she gets to go first.
I think the word empathy comes the most to mind. When I was thinking about the first piece I wrote it in my 20s. And in reflection, I feel like it represents sort of some of the challenges or the tough pieces of when I was a kid. But now when I reread it, like 10, 15 years later, I realize what my mom was probably going through and probably not having time for herself, in addition to being a woman, who had escaped a war, who was starting a life all over, whose degree didn't matter, who was learning a new language, who was going back to school while raising a kid, and whose husband was looking for work too. And I just understand and empathize and get how hard that must have been. And yet I feel like I also have sympathy or empathy for that kid who felt like you're not as present as I wish you could be. And then I think in terms of just my writing, like the biggest thing is just time and having the time to do it, and feeling a certain access to emotions that I didn't have before. Like I always tell my friends how I feel very exposed and raw, like when you have your kid and they're upset or hurt or something and you can't help them. It's such a insanely difficult thing to witness and not get to help. So just that word, empathy, is the biggest thing that has changed, and I think it's helped me as a writer. How about you guys?
Okay, I think I'm next in terms of the ages of our kids. So I have two. And I read a piece about, I do think like becoming a mom and just getting older, you begin to understand how much more complicated everything is. There was a line that was really famous from the book Little Women, and they reiterated it in the film, where I think it's Marmee says, "I am angry every single day." And I get that. I understand it, and I saw it in my mom, and I see it in myself, and I see it in my daughter. And what do you do with that anger every day? How do you allow it to become a fuel for yourself instead of just tiring you? So I think it's interesting, like especially when I write anything about motherhood. I even wrote about childbirth before I even went through it, and what did I know when I was writing it? But I do find, while I certainly have less time to write, because I'm giving a lot of time to them, like they are the priority, and I don't mind that they are the priority. I don't mind that they get everything from me. Everything I see that they experience, all the joys, the extremities of their emotions, the way they still look at the world with such love and hope, that helps me survive, right? That helps abate some of the anger, and that helps me go back to writing, so that finding that balance where I can write and then come back to them full of joy and full of excitement for the things that they want, I think it can have a really good relationship. And I think having kids, I think being a mom has really been the other side of being able to see and understand my family, understand why they couldn't play with me, why they couldn't laugh with me. The reason why was because they were working hard to give me the space to be able to laugh and to be free and to have joy. And what I need to do now is to give that to my kids, to give them the space to feel those things. And in a way, show my anger, how I'm feeling in ways that will energize them, instead of making them feel burdened, instead of making them feel like I'm blaming them or I'm upset with them.
Well, I guess this is the next one.
I don't know why I asked this question. I wanted to hear the other people answer. My son he recently turned 21, and I guess one of the things for me, I was a young mother, and I was not planning on being a mother, and I went through being a single mother for a part of the time, and also trying to be a writer. So I think like one of the biggest challenges is just that, like just juggling all those multiple roles and ambitions, and trying to find the time, trying not to feel guilty for having like my own thing that I'm like trying to pursue at the same time. I'm, like sometimes 24/7, like being a parent. And I look back on it now and I feel like incredibly grateful, and like for the amount of things that I have still been able to do. And then also seeing my son have his own creative life. He's also interested in, like, he also has his own creative pursuits. And so that's like something that's like really heartening to see. And mostly like, I feel like I've encountered I don't have a lot of women friends who are also mothers, except for like the people on this stage, who are also writers and mothers. And I think that that's like part of like, what this group has also been about, and that like, it's been like an ongoing, like I want to see more of it, like more women doing those multiple roles at the same time, so.
I don't think I've ever seen writers talk about being mothers. I really like that. We're human beings, and we are women, and we are mothers, and we have expectations. All of us had to work, right? All of us had aspirations to be writer, creative people, and maybe have pressure from the family to make money, and maybe to not tell too much, or so much, or not say anything. And that's some pressure that sometimes, is not seen. So I'm really happy we got to talk about this. My son is 26, so that's why I'm last. I had him first year of graduate school, and then I ended up being a single mom too. So the challenge is that although I was really being creative before that, I really had to stop to get an education, have a job, take care of my son. And that was a priority, and it's not just now in my 50s. So I spent the time, since I couldn't do it myself, to support other writers, right, which filled me. But now, thanks to you guys, thank you for inviting me to be part of this. So it gave me space to get to it. And these things about being a writer, you think, it's just, you write because, you want to write. But for me, it's not a choice, is a promise I made myself when I was 10. Something happened in my family, and I say, either I run away or either I write one day. So it was a deal I made with myself, and I said, okay, I'm going to write one day. So until I sit down and I write whatever story I had to write, this little girl won't leave me alone, so I'm going to do it. So being a mom is also to have been there for my child, but also be there for my inner child as I get older. And to be creative is a blessing and a bit of a curse as a woman with a lot of expectations to be a good partner and a good worker and a good helper and all of that.
let's see. Yeah.
So this collective came together almost 5 years ago, and Dao and I were just talking. We realized this summer is going to be our 5th anniversary when we first gathered in Isabelle's living room to do a salon, which is amazing. I can't imagine my life without the members of this collective. It's created a sisterhood for my writing that I'd never had before. And so that's why I think this question is especially important. And it's, how does being part of this collective affect your own creativity and your own awareness or perspectives of being a Vietnamese American woman and your own sense of community? I would answer, but I just asked the question. So I'll answer like the third.
Dao, why don't you start?
Okay. Well, I'll say like, I think that maybe it shows in some of the pieces that you've heard that there are commonalities in our experience. And that was maybe one of the biggest things that I've encountered in being in this group of people, is just realizing, first of all, that many of us had challenging relationships with our mothers. And this might be related a lot to the fact of being refugees, coming from parents who went through a war, who've dealt with like certain degrees of trauma, and observing how that has affected mothers, especially Vietnamese mothers, and the next generation. I think that for me, like, I would say this has been a healing experience, but I've also learned something about healing, which is that it doesn't really happen overnight. And it doesn't, it's given a space to talk about a lot of things and to share experiences, and to also provide a context for our writing and for like, you know, like the type of writing we're doing, but also the content of it. And also that it's a sort of ongoing experience of, and that's sort of the larger question of the diaspora, the Vietnamese diaspora, that I find myself wrestling with. Is just, there is a certain amount of collective trauma or collective experience that we're all wrestling with. And something about the sharing of stories is important. And it happens, like, I feel like there's a certain amount we can do on our own, and then there's something else that happens when we come together too. So I'll stop there.
I feel like writing is such an isolated experience where we're kind of pecking away on our own and going around and around in circles for, you know, a line or a sentence or a piece of dialogue. And what has been such a pleasant surprise has been the collaboration, and that's just been a lot of fun. And I have really appreciated for example, we were in Corsica and we had writing prompts for each other, and we would go off and do our own bits, and then Dao, it was primarily Dao, right, would cut the pieces up and meld it back together again in a way that was so beautiful, and it told a story that would often have shared themes, and yet our voices were so distinct in it. There was something, just a neat resonance, and yeah, just a really special project that has meant a lot to me.
So actually, not come from a refugee mother, from an immigrant mothers, and now as in France, and we're doing some work in France with DIVAN, right? Because a lot of people before the war, after the war, right, were spread in different countries, right? And family were fragmented. A lot of family here, there, over there, right? So it makes sense for us to work in different places and bring people together and share stories. But one thing that happened in France seems to be like you can only have room for one writer, right? So you go there right now, we're going to have a residency of European Vietnamese writers this summer, and my goodness, I hear so many gossip, oh, not this one, not this one, not this one, right? Because, you know, it seems like you can be only one, so there's some competitions, and, you know, and even here, I mean, like 20 years ago, is, you know, I don't know if this could have been happened, this competition because there's only room for one. And one thing that, you know, we have been trying to do with this group, two things. One is to break tokenism, to come together. We don't have to be one. We actually be stronger if we help each other out and support each other, and we'll be more heard, right? And then three, right now, Vietnamese American writers are getting a lot of attentions, but, you know, there's also a lot of women's writings, and they have pressures that some men don't have, right? We don't have a wife to help us sometimes, right? I mean, we have enormous pressure sometimes from families to be a certain ways and not to be certain ways. So we found it very important, the idea to come together is to provide this special space and mutual support and listening to one another, collaborate around issues that are difficult, right? Who can be taboo, right? It's like, oh, you know, I mean, I've been writing about domestic violence, you know, talking about San Jose. Well, I haven't been invited there anymore, right? Since then, it's a certain topic you don't talk about within the community sometime or within the family. So we say, well, maybe we together we can give each other strength to speak about things and write about things that, you know, we're taught not to, or we don't feel like doing it, but if we don't, it stays inside. And the power of art is to bring the inside out. And that's where the healing process comes. So that's one thing I think that you as masters is providing us, and that's why we keep doing it. And we're really encouraging for people to do this. It's not that complicated, but it really pays off.
It's interesting that these are the two questions we'll probably do in the Q&A, because I think one of the things that I love the most about being in this collective, which is so interesting that Dao started it, and we were all here in the Bay Area, and she's in Portland. She comes down, she's like, we have to get together. And we'd been living like 5-10 minutes away from each other, and it never occurred to us to get together in this way. And there was something magical about suddenly we had permission to be together and to talk to each other. And that question about motherhood, yes, like I have fully embraced that identity, and I love my children, but when I'm with these women and when I'm with this collective, I get to be a different person. I get to be a person who I really love also, who's fun and playful and goofy and can do things that I couldn't do around my family when I have all these responsibilities. They give me this freedom to be imaginative and creative and mischievous. And that's really important, I think, as a human, but also as a writer. And we get to do that together. And I also agree with Dao. There's something about understanding, like we know it very objectively, that we share this history that was profoundly affected by world events. But it isn't until we hear and we're hanging out, like whether it's by a pool or sitting in between readings and we're sharing small stories, that we see how many similarities in our very different stories that we have. And it makes me feel a lot less alone as a human being and as a writer. And so I think these women know me in a way that like my kids never will, or my husband never will. And for that, I feel like it has made me a better writer, and you know, and makes me want to keep improving. Ariel?
Thank you.
Thank you so
should we switch over to Q&A now, or should we?
It's
This
time.
is it? Okay.
Thank you
All
so
right.
much for coming out.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And congratulations to Dao on the reissue of her book.
Thank you all for being here.